Welcome to our live webinar, Pharmaceutical Industry Licensing Updates for 2024, that is taking place on Tuesday, October 15th, 2024. My name is Aisha Stewart and I'll be your moderator. Please note following today's webinar, there will be a few evaluation questions that I will share with you. In addition, a copy of the slides from the presentation is available in the handout section, which is right next to the Q&A box. There are also several related resources included there for your reference. Our presenter today is Hans Hauk, Manager of Content Management for CT Corporation. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Hans. Welcome, Hans.
Thanks, Aisha, and hope everybody can hear me okay. We were having some audio issues, so let me know if I blip out. I'll try my best to sound as clear for you as possible. But welcome everyone to this sort of fireside chat we're calling Regulatory Tracker Pharma 2024 Digest. Now, the genesis of this webinar came out of a desire to really synthesize and boil down a series that already exists. So currently my team sends out a quarterly report of legislative changes in the pharma industry to subscribers called Regulatory Tracker Pharma. So we will research and gather updates to rules and regulations and other matters pertinent to businesses in the pharma realm each quarter and deliver it in an organized report to a list of subscribers. And so this webinar is going to be sort of a highlight reel of that quarterly series. We're going to talk about some regulatory trends, notable laws passed, and also try to look ahead at what might be coming down the regulatory pipeline in the future. Pretty broad here for the most part. I'm certainly going to touch on individual laws passed and rules adopted, but for the most part, I'm going to be talking broad trends and measures in the half hour we have here. But if you want to stay up to date on specific bills passed for each state and view the actual text of the bills and things like that, you can subscribe to that regulatory report. If you do have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and pop them in that Q&A box. I'll try to answer some as I go and also at the end if we have time. One quick shout out to my team, Colby Ringenberg, Claire Corbin, and Kadila Vaz for helping with researching these laws and developments. And then just one final disclaimer, I'm not an attorney, so just know that anything I go over here, any laws that I summarize or whatever it may be, it doesn't constitute legal advice or opinion. So just a quick about me. I've been working in business compliance for about 11 years now. Currently, I manage a wing of the Wolters Kluwer CT Business Licensing Research Team dedicated to maintaining and improving our knowledge base of business licensing regulations across all industries. And so my job at Wolters Kluwer is to stay on top of changes in regulation that are going to affect our clients in whatever industry they're in. So let's dive right in, starting with some changes pushed out at the federal level. I'm going to talk first about opioids and naloxone. So we're all aware that the opioid abuse epidemic has been a major focus of the federal government, certainly for the past few years, though actually for a bit, a recent government report indicated a 4% decrease in opioid overdose deaths, primarily from a decrease in fentanyl use in 2024. So that's great. But several significant measures were implemented in the recent calendar quarters to continue to address the situation. One of the key initiatives is the State and Tribal Opioid Response Grants Program, which essentially granted $1.5 billion to state and tribal access to medications for opioid use disorder, and just generally providing better recovery support services. And a big part of the program has been increased funding for naloxone distribution. So if you're on this call, you're probably familiar, but naloxone is an opioid overdose reversal drug, and under this federal program, the availability of naloxone has been significantly expanded. And just last year and into this year, the FDA approved the first over-the-counter version of Narcan, which is the naloxone nasal spray, making it more accessible in pharmacies and without the need for a prescription. So manufacturers have ramped up production, wholesale distributors have increased distribution, and pharmacies have really been stocked with it in an effort to really saturate, especially the most affected communities, with what this really is a life-saving drug. So at the federal level, and thus popping up at the state level, we're seeing emergency orders authorizing expanded access to naloxone and things of that nature to sort of get in lockstep with the federal government. And we'll talk about some more specific state measures as we cover state updates in the next slide. Let's talk about the Model State Pharmacy Act and telepharmacy a little bit. So we've seen some updates to the Model State Pharmacy Act of the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, that's the NABP. And I'm adding this in here even though it's not technically federal legislation, because a lot of states do base their own pharma industry regulation on the NABP's Model Act. You know, it is what its name implies. It's a model for pharmaceutical law. And although it's not mandated law, by looking at changes to the Model Act, we can sort of predict what issues might become legislative bills for states moving forward. So sort of a bellwether, if you will. And one area of the Act that the NABP has focused on for updates in 2024 is telepharmacy. And what they've done is replace restrictive language surrounding telepharmacy services with broader language to really increase the applicability of telepharmacy across the pharma space. And federal regulators are following suit, or at least they seem to be. The Telehealth Modernization Act of 2024 is a bill that extends several Medicare telehealth flexibilities that were introduced during the pandemic, including the ability for healthcare providers like occupational therapists, physical therapists, to offer telehealth services to Medicare patients. It also removes those geographic restrictions that used to be in place for telehealth services, allowing rural and underserved communities to access care more easily. It also extends audio-only telehealth options, ensuring patients without access to internet or high-speed internet can still receive care. So just a lot of measures going toward expanding telehealth federally. Now, at the time of this webinar, that particular bill has passed through committees and is awaiting consideration. So jury's out on whether it becomes ironclad law, but regardless, it does seem that the state of the industry is trending in the direction of expanding telehealth and telepharmacy. Now, moving on, one of the biggest catalysts for regulatory updates, and you'll see it in the middle there, certainly at the state level, has been the Federal Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And I say at the state level because, as you know, states are the main regulators of the actual pharma business types. Pharmacies, wholesale drug distributors, manufacturers, 3PLs. But of course, federal laws do have teeth, and the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, though it has actually been around for over a decade, is really just the past year or so beginning to take shape, and a lot of its regulations are beginning their effective dates. And so a lot of states are now scrambling to align with the federal act, but we'll talk about that a bit more in the next section as well. The broad strokes to be aware of regarding the Drug Supply Chain Security Act for our purposes here are that it mandates stricter record-keeping requirements for any facility involved in the supply chain. It seeks to solidify and codify the chain of custody for a drug from the point of manufacture to the wholesale distribution to the eventual sale to consumers. And so we're talking about, first of all, drug product tracing. So the Act requires manufacturers, repackagers, distributors, and dispensers like pharmacies to provide transaction information, transaction history, and transaction statements for each drug product. We're also talking about notification requirements in the case that a drug is identified somewhere along the chain as being illegitimate in some way. So the DSCSA, that doesn't sound very good. I'm just going to say the Drug Supply Chain Security Act mandates notifying the FDA if that happens, and it prescribes the process to remove an illegitimate product from the chain. The Act also mandates that all prescription drugs in the supply chain have a unique identifier number, basically a serial number, to allow for electronic tracing and tracking, and it establishes the electronic tracking database for the drugs within the supply chain. And then finally, well, I don't want to say finally because it's a hefty piece of legislation, but the final thing I'll note is that it establishes national standards for licensing third-party logistics providers and wholesale drug distributors. So it replaces the previous kind of patchwork of state-level regulations, which gives it uniformity and ensures that all distributors are subject to the same requirements. And so you can imagine the effect that this federal mandate has on states who are starting to look at their own pharma laws and notice how many updates they're needing to make. Finally, up there, let's look at some updates to vaccines and disease prevention, beginning with COVID vaccine requirements. Now, the FDA, as you know, is constantly updating policies and recommendations for COVID vaccines. And in 2024 specifically, the FDA updated its guidelines for COVID-19 vaccines to better protect against some new circulating variants. So the newly authorized vaccines now target the KP2 strain, which is a descendant of the Omicron variant. The changes were made in response to a rise in COVID cases this summer and also to just address the waning immunity. And why do I bring this up as a legislative update? Well, as long as vaccine recommendations and vaccines themselves are being updated, regulators and businesses in the industry will need to stay on their toes in relation to their own policies concerning, who can administer the vaccines, et cetera. I'm going to pause here before I move to the next slide. Am I still good? Is everyone can hear me? Okay. So moving on. Now, federal legislation is usually front page news, right? So that's out there. Everyone kind of knows what's going on. But let's talk a little bit about some trends we've seen at the state level, although obviously a lot of state measures are certainly still front page news as well. But as I mentioned a little while ago, state legislative trends are often influenced by federal shifts, either political or regulatory. And with that in mind, it's not surprising that a big subject being tackled by states in 2024 has involved access to contraceptives or birth control, as well as abortion-related care. This past spring, for instance, New Jersey codified the authorization allowing pharmacists to dispense self-administered hormonal contraceptives, adding certain forms of birth control that had previously not existed. Some states like California and Oregon have broadly allowed these kind of things for the better part of a decade, but other states like South Carolina are just now cementing the allowance into law. There have been a few notable restrictions as well. Indiana passed legislation that restricts access to certain contraceptive options for Medicaid recipients, only allowing subdermal contraceptives post-birth. So really restricting the kind of contraceptives that can be accessed by Medicaid recipients. And this matters to businesses because, of course, it determines what pharmacists will be legally allowed to dispense, what practitioners can prescribe, and where distributors and manufacturers can operate. As for abortion-related care specifically, this is all over the news, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into the entirety of what's been going on, but just for some 2024 updates, Nebraska passed legislation this year that restricts most abortions after the first trimester, allowing exceptions only in certain severe circumstances, which marks the shift from the previous 20-week abortion ban. After several legal battles, South Carolina implemented a 6-week abortion ban earlier this year as well, which significantly kind of reduces the window for legal abortions and adds a bunch of strict requirements for clinics. Colorado took action in the opposite direction by proposing a constitutional amendment that, if it gets passed in 2024 via the ballot initiative in the general election, would enshrine the right to an abortion in the state constitution. But again, we'll have to wait and see if that's ultimately passed. So that's that. Another trend we're seeing over in the past couple of years, really, and certainly in 2024, is increased transparency in drug prices. So I've seen bills aimed at both drug manufacturers and pharmacies intending to make drug prices more readily available and transparent for consumers, and to prevent price gouging and unreasonable markups and things like that. So to that end, states like Minnesota and Illinois, for instance, have introduced laws banning price gouging on generic drugs, empowering state attorneys general to investigate and penalize excessive price increases. New York also strengthened its regulations by adding prescription drugs to the list of goods subject to price gouging regulations during shortages. And to my point about transparency, Florida and New York now require drug manufacturers to provide advance notice before significant price hikes. So if you're a drug manufacturer operating across the U.S., just keep in mind that you may have to submit notification filings to various states in the event you raise the price of a drug beyond a certain threshold. Florida mandates that manufacturers notify consumers if drug prices are set to increase by more than 15%, while New York sets this threshold at 16%. Minnesota and New Jersey established prescription drug affordability boards to, review high-cost drugs and set upper payment limits. So just another sort of trend that we're seeing is the advent of these prescription drug affordability boards, which, they're not legislative in nature exactly, but they will help monitor and potentially reduce the cost of unaffordable medications. And then finally, keeping on drug affordability, states like New Mexico and Indiana pass laws requiring pharmacy benefit managers and insurers to pass rebates from drug manufacturers directly to health plans, which should reduce drug costs, I would think, for consumers at the point of sale. That doesn't always happen, but that's at least the aim. Okay, let's talk a little bit about pharmacy technician expanded authority, which has been huge for the past year, 2 years. Certainly in recent quarters, the expansion of these authorized duties for pharmacy technicians, we see so many laws centered around those at the state level. And what's happening is a ton of states are passing legislation granting pharmacy technicians the authority to do things like administer vaccines, consult with patients under certain circumstances, and perform more pharmacist-adjacent duties. Some examples are California passing House Bill 1286, which took effect this January, and it essentially allows pharmacy technicians to prepare and administer flu and COVID vaccines, epinephrine, and perform specimen collection for certain tests. Oregon adopted new rules allowing pharmacy techs to perform final product verification, which was previously limited only to certain settings. And New Jersey recently implemented a program where pharmacy technicians are authorized to distribute naloxone, which I mentioned in the last slide, to patients anonymously as part of broader efforts to combat those opioid overdoses. And it doesn't take a lot of digging really to understand that these expanded authority for pharmacy tech, these laws centered around that, they're really popping up in large part due to a strain on staffing levels. Pharmacies are struggling to keep up with increased traffic due to our aging population. And so they're granting more leeway for pharmacy technicians to jump in and handle some of the duties they had traditionally been excluded from. And this staffing shortage, it's actually causing kind of a two-sided coin of legislative measures. So on the one hand, states are granting more responsibilities to pharmacy technicians, often pairing it with additional continuing education requirements or stricter criteria for becoming certified. But on the other hand, states have begun codifying staffing level requirements as well for pharmacies and other facilities. So depending on the size of your facility, no staff member can work more than X hours without a break. They're restricting hours of operation for certain facilities. And those sort of labor standards that were fuzzy or maybe didn't make sense for the pharma industry specifically prior. So keep that in mind as well. Let's talk a little bit about alignment with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which we had mentioned in the previous slide as well. What we're seeing at the state level is a ton of legislation or rule updates aimed at aligning state regulation with that federal act. So Virginia this past August, for instance, adopted rules that really clarified chain of custody requirements, specifically for EMS satellite locations. They looked at their law and realized essentially that they had so many blind spots related to who was authorized to stock and remove drugs from EMS satellite locations. And so in August, they adopted ironclad rules kind of specifying all of that to kind of get in line with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act's mandates on drug traceability and chain of custody. And so many state laws and rules that have been enacted this past, really the past 2 years have sprung out of that same kind of situation. States realizing that their laws aren't quite up to the standards of that act. Most of it, I can tell you, has been addressing the chain of custody issue because, like we said, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act wants to know exactly where a drug is at every step of the chain, but also record keeping, inventory, and things of that nature. Moving on to remote dispensing and telehealth. So I mentioned telehealth in the federal section on the last slide, and I noted that many states take cues from the National Association of Board of Pharmacies Model Pharmacy Act. And so I wanted to give a few specific examples real quick of initiatives in states that are furthering telehealth and remote dispensing of prescription drugs. So Wisconsin, for instance, updated its telepharmacy rules earlier this year, allowing pharmacies to operate as both traditional and remote dispensing sites, which is huge. Texas passed updated regulations allowing remote dispensing kiosks to operate in rural areas without the requirement for a pharmacist to be physically present. Essentially, they just need to be able to monitor that kiosk remotely via telecommunications, where they can oversee the dispensing and patient counseling remotely. And even states that are traditionally quiet when it comes to regulatory trends, like those Midwest, upper North Midwest states, Montana, North Dakota, are taking measures to implement remote dispensing legislation. So Montana now allows remote pharmacies to be set up within 20 miles of an existing pharmacy. North Dakota allows up to 50 miles from the nearest traditional pharmacy. And this actually makes sense when you examine it, as those states, harbor populations that are super rural and maybe hours away from the nearest traditional pharmacy. Now, this expansion into this sort of virtual space is pretty much across the board. A lot of smaller amendments that states are passing have to do with altering language to facilitate online filings for regulatory matters. Most states are moving from form filing by paper to online portal filing. Alabama made the switch this year, so did Iowa. So just keep your eye on that aspect. We recently did some form submissions that we thought were traditional paper mail filings that got rejected and sent back to us because the board actually requires electronic submissions now, and they just hadn't really been very vocal about it. So keep track of that shift so that you don't make extra work for yourself resubmitting things. Okay, now as best as we can, let's look ahead to what may be on the horizon for pharma industry legislation. An obvious fulcrum that we can look to is ballot measures that are actually already getting voted on by early voters as we speak. As we mentioned earlier, abortion-related care is the top of a lot of ballot initiatives. Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Colorado all have abortion laws on the ballot. We can also look at the proposed budget for 2025 as an indicator of where things might be going. So the current administration's budget proposal contains major funding for naloxone distribution, so that's going to continue to be expanded. And we can hope that the reduction in opioid overdoses that we saw this year will continue as a result there. We can certainly expect to see a continuation of measures aimed at reducing drug costs for consumers. One subject I didn't really touch on is the promotion of consumer access to what are called biosimilars, which are essentially replicas or near replicas of biologic drugs, kind of like generic versions. And we're starting to see more states incorporate language promoting biosimilars, or at least removing barriers. In 2025 and beyond, I think we're going to see this continue through streamlining the approval process for biosimilars, incentives or maybe even subsidies for developing them, and preventing branded manufacturers from getting in the way through any kind of anti-competitive behavior. Another area I didn't touch on is environmental sustainability in pharmaceuticals, which I think is going to be big in coming years. We have seen some states banning PFAs and regulating biomedical waste a little more strictly, so that could continue to trend, and certainly businesses in the pharma realm want to be aware of that for their facilities. Absolutely, as I mentioned, digital health and telemedicine isn't going anywhere. And AI in the health world is a behemoth monster just knocking at the door. So I would bet money on there being a lot of discussion related to AI machine learning in drug development, AI diagnoses and patient consultation, and use cases that we probably can't even imagine AI being used for, but it's there. I'm following that every day. Ask anybody here. I'm a pretty big student of it. So, and then finally, a quick shout out to psychedelics. So, as you know, there have been major steps taken to revise drug scheduling laws to at least incorporate What studies have shown are therapeutic benefits of psychedelics into the federal drug registers for those products with the aim of reclassifying them. So I would imagine we could continue to see breakthroughs in that realm as well. Okay, I did see some questions. Let me see. I can't advance my slide, but if someone could, that would be great. I did see some questions, and I'd like to sort of lightning around as many of them as I can before we're at time. Is there a central resource for monitoring changes in state and federal pharma laws? So when we're gathering information for our quarterly tracker report, we use LexisNexis StateNet, which is kind of a bill tracker software. We do all the work, obviously, of sifting through and finding what's relevant for our client base and for pharmaceutical businesses in the realm. But that is a good resource. I think there is a subscription cost to that. There is the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy website that houses a lot of the state newsletters and provides their own kind of newsletter as well that updates you. And then you have the Regulatory Tracker Pharma Report that I mentioned, and I'll just shamelessly plug again. It comes out every quarter. It's a nice PDF report that's very navigable. It contains summaries of all the bills that were passed that are relevant to pharma business compliance, and it contains links to the bill text and things like that. So it's a little more comprehensive than what we've talked about here. Let's see, what else? Will PDMPs be phased out now that there are drug tracing requirements within the Drug Supply Chain Security Act? So PDMPs are prescription drug monitoring programs. So will these be phased out now that there's so much tracking in the Drug Supply Chain Security Act? I don't think that'll happen, mainly because PDMPs and the tracking requirements of the new Drug Supply Chain Security Act serve different purposes. So PDMPs are there to track and monitor controlled substances being dispensed to consumers, whereas the federal database is meant to monitor the supply chain of a drug from start to finish and prevent things like counterfeiting, stolen drugs, contamination, and things like that. So no, I don't think PDMPs are going anywhere. I think they're going to remain a fixture. Do many states require licenses for telepharmacy? This is a yes and no. So not very many states have specific telepharmacy licenses, but as we mentioned earlier, the incorporation of telepharmacy into the fold of basic pharma practice is sort of making it so that it's just another method of providing healthcare. So if you're practicing telepharmacy in whatever capacity, you'll probably just need to be licensed to practice in that capacity, probably with some additional rules you'll need to be aware of for the telepharmacy aspect. There are a couple of exceptions. Florida, I believe, maintains a telehealth provider registration requirement it's like if you don't have a Florida license, but you want to treat Florida patients via telehealth, I believe you do need to register with that specific telehealth registration. So there are some possible exceptions, and it's just important to stay aware of what the laws are for whichever state your patients or clients are in. I think that about wraps this up. I don't want to delve into another one, but please stay on the line because there's a quick survey. Man, it feels like I blew through that without. I mean, this is stuff you could talk about for days. We could have a 3-day sort of symposium on this kind of stuff. But I hope you all enjoyed or found useful some of this information about the trends and the regulatory changes that have been happening in pharma. And I'll pass it back off to Aisha to close us out.
And thank you, Hans. Before we conclude today's webinar, I would like to go over a few survey questions. The first is, would you like to speak with a CT expert about our business license services or receive information about our quarterly farmer tracker report? Again, that is, would you like to speak with a CT expert about our business license services or receive information about our quarterly farmer tracker report? And moving on to the second question. Please rate the value of today's webinar content on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Again, that is, please rate the value of today's webinar content on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. And moving on to the final question. Please rate to, please rate today's presenter on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Again, that is, please rate today's presenter on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Thank you for joining. This concludes today's live webinar. You may now disconnect.